So, as we were talking in the previous lesson, that this novel, The Great Derangement, it suggests that literature should take up more and more climate issues, and especially important writers of the day, canonical writers of today, who are bestsellers and who are highly marketable. So, what exactly is the unthinkable in climate change? The unthinkable refers to events on phenomena that are so large in scale, complex, and disruptive that they lie beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. That's why it is unthinkable. What is happening in climate is something that has never been thought of. The destruction, the vast scale of destruction, the immensity of the destruction, the loss of lives and properties, the huge displacement caused by these climate events has never been imagined or thought of before. And there it crosses the boundaries of normal climate experience, and that's why he uses the word unthinkable. Natural disasters like floods, hurricanes, and rising sea levels, key symptoms of climate change, fall into this category because they do not fit comfortably into the traditional narratives of realistic fiction, which favor individual or small scale conflicts. So, if we think about this important writer, Leo Tolstoy, his work War and Peace, or his works Anna Karenina. They are classics for all time. But these writers, they do not deal with the climate. They only deal with things that are happening in social society, and if ever the non-human is in consideration, it is used only as a symbol to further the story. So this reminds me of Anna Karenina, this important novel by Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer who has inspired generations of writers. There we have the story of a woman who is unfaithful to her husband, and the man with whom she is in love. Uh, Now, Anna is in love with Vronsky, who's a soldier, and he has a kind of attraction and a smartness in him that she does not find in her husband. Anyway, so though the idea is marital infidelity and the social corruption, that it was very common, and Anna was different because she faced the guilt of doing wrong. But we are not going to that. We are talking about the non-human used in that novel. There is the scene of a horse that Vronsky has betted on. So the rich capitalist society had plenty of money to throw, so there used to be horse races. And there is this beautiful mare that Vronsky owns, and he thinks that it will win the race for him, but it fails to win the race. And then his treatment of the mare, when he sees that it has had an accident or it breaks a leg, the way he kicks it and has it shot, shows his attitude to the other humans in his life. He will uh, throw away anyone who is not useful for him. So, here we do not have anything of the environment, but parts of the environment. The non human is used to suggest something, to suggest his corrupt nature, to suggest his unstable character. So we can see that in this way nature has occurred and been there in various novels, but the focus has not been on the climate impacts. So, according to Ghosh, realistic fiction was developed within the framework of predictable everyday, emphasizing rationality and continuity. So, but climate change is irrational. You cannot reason with it. It can happen anytime. It is nature that does not think, but it is a cycle which moves in patterns, and for thousands and thousands of years, it moved on its own patterns. But in the last 1000 years, human beings have become agents of climate change. They have started influencing climate. So, when their interference and their exploitation is there, the result is an unthinkable result. It is unthinkable outcomes of the fury of nature. So, Ghosh says that realistic fiction did not have that in its framework to deal with the unpredictable, and to deal with something that was irrational. Irrational that went beyond reason. So, climate is not given a reason, but it has a cause. The climate change has a cause. Now it is not going by its own patterns. Human beings are imposing a pattern by interfering with them, by exploiting nature, by uh, disturbing the ecosystems. So, climate change is filled with unpredictability, involving sudden violent changes that disrupt the stability of communities and entire ecosystems. So, what happens in climate change now? Things cannot be predicted. Human activity has gone to such an extent in destroying the environment and disturbing and upsetting ecosystems that the stability of community life is destroyed. Humans are being killed, and they are unpredictable changes. There is no rationality there. They are unpredictable changes. There is a fury, and it is not predictable. So these days, in the European countries, they are trying to develop all kinds of uh, technological apparatus to predict tsunamis and to predict hurricanes and tidal waves and earthquakes. And yet, in a country like Turkey, an advanced country like Turkey, um, there was vast destruction and huge loss of lives because of earthquakes. So, in spite of all the monitoring and the warnings, it still happened, and people were leveled, lives were over. So, he wants to talk about the issue of climate change and fit it into literature, that it should be a genre in its own way, and it is something that is not traditional. So, literature should take it up. So, the examples of this unpredictability of climate change are floods and storms can decimate cities in a matter of hours, altering landscapes and livelihoods without warning. We have so many examples of what happened when this tsunami came, a great disaster, or the recent earthquakes in different parts of the world, or the hurricanes that are there in America, or the heavy rains and storms that have been in South India and the Northeast. So they are sudden and extremely destructive, and the most vulnerable are worst impacted. Their livelihoods are taken away, they lose their homes, and they are displaced populations. So the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases which are warming up the atmosphere, are triggering so many climate calamities. Rising temperatures and melting ice caps are affecting species extinction, agriculture, and migration patterns on a global scale. So, as we discussed earlier, there are so many outcomes of climate impacts, of rising sea levels, of glacial melts, of the earth growing warmer. So many plant and animal species are lost, human lives are lost, people are displaced forever. So these are all happening on a global scale. And Ghosh says that one must bring this into perception, into the perception of readers. So fiction needs to deal with climate change. And these phenomena, as I said, they don't go by rationality. They do not adhere to human made boundaries, and they do not have predictable timelines. So they are difficult to capture through standard literary techniques. So, as he says, that even the style of writing will have to be innovative. The style would have to be adaptive and open to discuss climate issues which do not follow in a predictable manner, and which do not come within the frame of man made boundaries or man made expectations. So he says that literature has to accommodate these issues of climate change in order to save humanity and to save the future. Critique of the literary world. Ghosh's critique extends to the broader literary community, which he believes has largely neglected its responsibility to address global crisis. The lack of climate representation in realist fiction, Ghosh argues that despite its real world consequences, climate change rarely appears in novels as a central theme. At least it does not from before the 1970s, it was not. The literary preference for human centric narratives. Realistic fiction tends to prioritize individual and family dramas, focusing on human agency and choice. So, I did mention this novel, Anna Karenina, in which it's about family drama and about human beings, but it's all human agency, and the non human does not have an agency or a voice in it. Gender boundaries. Ghosh suggests that the problem lies not only with realist fiction but also with genre boundaries that limit creative engagement with climate issues. While speculative and science fiction have explored apocalyptic and environmental themes, they are often considered escapist or separate from serious literary work. So there are problems of genres, and there are certain limitations for writers, and because of the involvement of the apocalyptic and the environmental themes in science fiction, they are criticized for being non-serious and not taken up as part of literary work. So, fitting in climate impacts into literature is also something very challenging. So, he suggests new forms of storytelling to deal with this problem: hybrid narratives, collective narratives, incorporating non human perspectives. So, what are hybrid narratives? Combining realism, mythology, folklore, and speculative fiction to create narratives that address the magnitude of climate change. So it's like myth and reality are combined, and even speculative fiction is combined to address the vast scale of climate impacts. Collective narratives. So instead of focusing on individual characters or isolated conflicts, literature should embrace collective stories that highlight community experiences and resilience and survival in the face of environmental crisis. So another suggestion is to talk about the collective courage and bravery of people in facing climate impacts and moving away from individual uh, social situations and about isolated conflicts. So fiction should talk about the collective stories of resilience and survival against the environmental threats, against the climate change impacts. Also, when we talked about Anna Karenina just now, we talked about the non human not having a voice. So he believes that the non human should also be given a voice. So the non human perspectives also need to be incorporated. He says that literature can benefit from including the perspectives of animals, plants, and ecosystems to reflect the interconnectedness of all life forms. So, the there have been various works related to eco spirituality in which the voice and the wisdom of plants and the wisdom of animals is taken into consideration. So, here is this idea of eco spirituality which fits in about listening to the environment and in and giving the perspectives of animals, plants, and ecosystems in writing. So this is a very challenging area. If we talk about a tree that is broken or that has been cut down, and you do not describe in fiction as a human viewing that cut down tree, rather the tree talking about its issues, that is a different perspective. This kind of thing is very rare, but it can be a valuable way to address climate change. We have this book, uh, The Cry of the Earth, Eco Spirituality, The Cry of the Earth by Levlin Vaughanley, which we discussed in the earlier lessons. And it means the cry of the earth. The earth is crying. So there is the attention paid to the sound of the earth, to the feelings of the earth, to the emotions of the earth. So the earth is weeping at what is happening to it. So this shows there's an interconnectedness of all life forms, and it should find a place in literature. And what are the implications of Ghosh's perspectives on literature and society? Ghosh suggests that literature has the power to shape collective imagination, and by failing to address climate change, it reinforces societal denial and inaction. So he says to be silent on the living beings of the planet, or silent to the uh, travails of the non human beings on the planet, it reinforces the society's attitude of indifference and inaction. So he tries to bring in his book the idea that climate change is urgent enough to find a place in literature, and then he gives books that have been published in the 1980s and onwards that talk about climate change directly. There's a lot of fiction that he talks about, and so we see that such work was not to be found in the 17th, 18th, and the 19th centuries. He argues that just as literature once grappled with issues like war, colonialism, and human rights issues, it must now confront the environmental crisis with similar urgency. So it should not take this climate urgency as something that is unimportant, that should be left to the future or left to the experts. Fiction needs to take this up urgently, because the science of climate change is difficult to convey to the public. So, as we discussed earlier, also literature, through drama, through poetry, through films, is able to humanize this climate issue and to simplify the science, and that's why it can be communicated to the layman and the common public. So he says that when literature was so concerned about with issues of world peace and war and colonialism and human rights and women rights, so why must it not also take up climate issues, which are sort of threatening human life in totality? If climate changes, then humans cannot survive. So one can continue the fight for other rights as long as the climate supports one's existence. No other rights will exist if the climate is not balanced. One cannot survive in a frozen world, and one cannot survive in a earth which is so heated up that that it's impossible to live. So the thing is that he wants to point out that climate issues are as serious as all the previous issues taken up by literature, such as the political or economic or the gender issues or related to women, or so, and so many, so on and so forth. Uh, this issue is the most important of all. It is hovering over us like a threat, and it should be addressed, because without it, you can't address anything else. You need your world to be right before you can fight for other rights. So, through his own works, such as The Hungry Tide and Gun Island, Ghosh exemplifies how fiction can explore climate change by embedding it within rich narratives that resonate with the readers. So, literature is a humanizing force. It is a force of creativity. It has a sort of communication of human values. So, when it embeds all those science facts, it is able to communicate very richly with its readers. What are the major themes in Ghosh's works related to climate change? So, his work on climate change explores several interconnected themes, each illuminating different facets of the ecological crisis. His novels and essays tackle the complex relationship between human societies and natural ecosystems, and how historical forces like colonialism have intensified environmental issues, and how migration and displacement are increasingly linked to climate change. So, we can see that when he talks about climate change, he feels that there's a connection with history, with a connection with the colonial setups, the colonial history, and he is concerned about the political and the economic issues of today, because climate change is um associated with them. So his themes cover so many ideas. Then, by incorporating spiritual and cultural narratives, his works also highlight the importance of traditional knowledge in understanding and addressing ecological challenges. So, let us go into a detailed exploration of each of these themes. So, they are the ideas of post colonialism, which I discussed earlier in many of his novels, and the idea of post colonialism talks about how the colonized people suffered economically. Their agriculture was tampered with, and the new crops which were beneficial or which were economically viable for the colonizer, they were forced upon the native, and thus the natural crops were removed, and the soil and the ecosystems were disturbed because the native Indian or the native farmer had a fixed pattern of growing certain seeds and certain grains and crops at a certain time, and his livelihood was based on that. So, in one of his books, we learn that book, The Sea of Poppies, the opium um, cultivation in India. Ghosh mentions that how post-colonialism ruined the the local crops by introducing the opium, and it was a cash crop, and it involved very hard labor, which was inflicted on Indians, and the early stages before opium is uh, extracted. That work is very difficult. So that book, The Sea of Poppies, tells us about it, and the pittance that the workers or the labor force gets for all this hard work at this opium creation, that is very less, and they fall into debt for generations and generations. Their own livelihood is gone. They're not getting anything for their crops, and they're not growing their crops. They are provided with something for the opium work that they do, which is barely nothing, and then the opium is sold in international markets at high prices. So the colonizer benefits from it. So things like this, the ruin of the environment, uh, the destruction of the natural crops, and the destruction of ecosystems. So these are all connected with climate change, and Ghosh deals with them. He deals with the spiritual and the cultural narratives also in some of his works, and he feels that traditional knowledge is very valuable in addressing ecological challenges. And so let us stop here. In the next lesson, we will explore some of these themes in detail, and I hope this lesson has given you a good idea of the variety and the expanse of Ghosh's work, fiction as well as non-fiction. Let us stop here today. We will meet in the next lesson. Thank you.